It's a question about fairness. It was said, and this sub-amendment deals with the main issue, the primary issue, and that's to have Carbon Tax Carney come before the committee. But it also addresses the desire of Liberal members. They wanted to have Jenny Byrne come to committee. I suppose that's their purview. Ms. Byrne has a business under her name, and they do zero federal lobbying, none, zero. And Ms. Byrne is also not a federal lobbyist, but they want her to come to committee. Okay, we agree to invite Ms. Byrne to come to committee and talk about how she doesn't have any involvement in federal lobbying. But if we're doing that, and it's a question about fairness that was raised by the Liberal members, well, then we need to have Don Guy come to committee.
Absolutely.
Now, I want to tell you why. And if we look at the St. Albert Gazette, which I think is, and they're publishing a Canadian Press article on 10 September 2024, and this article is titled "Carney Interested in Doing Something, Not Being Something," he says, of advisor role. That's the advisor role he has with the Liberal Party. The Liberals called in, the Canadian Press story says, the Liberals called in veteran strategist Don Guy to give his insights into how to mount a comeback and go up against Poilievre as they prepare for an election year. And Don Guy is a founding partner of a company called GT & Co., which, unlike Ms. Byrne's business, they have a significant federal lobbying practice. Notable clients, Loblaws. Perhaps that's how they got that fridge money from the Liberals. Loblaws, of course, owns Shoppers Drug Mart. The Canada Bread Company, which, as we know, had to plead guilty, or did plead guilty, to price fixing during a food price inflation and cost of living crisis. CN Rail, we know that the concerns there that caused a fracture in the confidence and supply agreement, the coalition with the NDP. The government seemed to have got a real nudge to get to binding arbitration, and one might wonder if that came from Mr. Guy, who is a federal lobbyist for CN Rail, and but also Airbnb, which the Liberals and the NDP have both accused of making the housing crisis worse. These are the clients of the individual, Mr. Guy, who is a federal lobbyist who was speaking at the taxpayer-funded Liberal caucus retreat. So let's get real here. Let's talk about fairness. Let's have Mr. Guy come before committee, and he can sit next to Miss Byrne, because that's who the Liberals want to have come to committee. Now, Mr. Guy employs the former director of caucus services and operations for the Liberal Research Bureau, a 5-year tenure Ms. DeWolf had, as well as other connected, well-connected Liberals. As Mr. Guy, also as the owner of Polera, he employs Dan Arnold. Dan Arnold, also a fixture at taxpayer-funded Liberal caucus retreats. This is Don Guy, the federal lobbyist, who sits in the room with the Prime Minister, his cabinet, his caucus, these Liberal members behind closed doors, advising them and representing his clients simultaneously, his clients being Airbnb, who the Liberals have said made the housing crisis work, CN Rail, the Canada Bread Company, who pled guilty of price fixing, and Loblaws. Whew. Like, I think that if we're getting fair, let's get fair. Let's get fair, and let's have him come before the committee. Now, along with Mr. Guy, we should include Brian Topp. He is the co-founding partner of GT & Co. And let's talk about, again, all of those examples that I gave about federal lobbying that's done by that company. Companies who have pled guilty of price fixing. Companies the Liberals have accused of exacerbating the housing crisis in our country. Companies that they've accused of gouging consumers. So, but who is Mr. Topp? Now, Mr. Topp is a noted New Democrat, former chief of staff to Rachel Notley, and he's got these connections. He is the employer of that same former Liberal Research Bureau director, responsible for caucus services and operations. So Topp and Guy should be sitting in seats 15 and 16, and we can save seat 17 for Miss Byrne, and then in seat 18, we should have Gurtan Singh come, because we know that the NDP leader has said that he has him on his arm for media scrums and for advice, and that he's a lobbyist for Metro. Right. Metro, which barely gets a mention from the NDP leader when he's talking about grocery giants. It's funny. It's funny. I wonder why we don't hear much mention of Metro.
It's weird.
It's highly suspicious indeed. Some might say. And so we want to see Topp and Guy and Singh and Miss Byrne. The difference, of course, with Miss Byrne is that she's the only one who's not a federal lobbyist. But they want to have her, and they want it to be fair. So let's be fair, and let's have them come here, and they can all appear on a panel together. But there's a couple important points in this motion, and that's that these individuals don't come before the committee. The invitations are not to be furnished to them until we've had Mr. Carney appear, because Mr. Carney's ducked committees before, and that's not acceptable that we don't have him come first. But if we're going to have the conversation about federal lobbying, we can deal with the many issues with the many conflicts of interest with Carbon Tax Carney, questionable practices with respect to lobbying. How did Brookfield get in the mix for what's going to be very lucrative time? How is it that their stock price hit 6-month highs when one of their subsidiaries, the largest private mortgage insurer in Canada, is going to benefit from a Liberal government announcement? And all of these things happened. His buddy at Telesat getting a $2 billion loan for satellite internet services that doesn't have any satellites and isn't providing any internet service. How did all of that good fortune land on all these people who are just happen to be connected to Mr. Carney in the hours that the ink's just drying on his agreement to become the de facto finance minister after Justin Trudeau's PMO said they didn't have confidence in Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister and deputy prime minister? How did that all come to happen? What did Mr. Carney have to give up for that? Well, we've seen that he's now sending out fundraising letters for the Liberals. So we hope to have support. We hope to have support from other members. We wanted to talk about fairness. This is fair. We're saying that the Conservative that's been suggested, that she ought to appear alongside the federal Liberal lobbyists who've been in the halls of power, who've been in the rooms behind closed doors when decisions are getting made, when strategy is being charted for the government and for their coalition partner. That's incredibly important. So when we have someone like the chair of Brookfield Global, this $1 trillion arch capitalist everything company. We hope that we can do whatever it takes. We can count on the NDP to do what it takes to bring Mr. Carney here to answer questions, answer for how he's enriching his friends in exchange for raising money for the Liberals. And we hope that the issue of fairness that was raised by the Liberal members, that's been addressed here. So let's see top guy sing, and we can have Ms. Byrne alongside them, though she's not a federal lobbyist and they do federal lobbying. Okay. I think there was a concern that they were going to appear for less time than Mr. Carney, and I think that's addressed as well. We'll have that panel for 2 hours, and this panel is going to occur after that invitation. Those invitations will be sent out after Mr. Carney comes. The most important thing isn't about protecting people who share the party affiliation. It's about accountability and transparency. It's about restoring Canadians' confidence. So let's put it plainly. We want carbon tax Carney here, and we think that the poison pill the Liberals think they put forward about having Ms. Byrne come, we'll make sure that the invitation is hand delivered. Will they do the same to their strategists? To the NDP, will they do the same to their strategists? Right. Let's see. Let's see who's interested in fairness and accountability for Canadians, and who's actually looking to circle the wagons and protect their insiders who've had that privileged access behind closed doors while lobbying for their federal clients. Let's see. The opportunities here for everyone. They just need to reach out and take it.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Picking up on where Mr. Barrett left off with respect to the sub-amendment, it is important that we hear from Don Guy and Brian Topp for the reasons mentioned by Mr. Barrett. But I think it's important to reflect on how we got here in the first place. Why the need to bring forward this sub-amendment came about. And it came about because every single day there seems to be more corruption, more conflict, and more scandal with arguably the most rotten and corrupt government in modern Canadian history, if not Canadian history. We have a Prime Minister who, unlike any Prime Minister in Canadian history, has been found guilty not once, but twice of breaking Canada's ethics laws. He was found guilty of being in conflicts of interest. And so, given that leadership starts at the top and the culture of a government starts at the top, it's no wonder that we have seen the kind of rot and corruption that has permeated throughout this entire Liberal government. And we now know that carbon tax Carney has become conflict Carney when the Prime Minister shamelessly appointed his rich pal Carney to serve as the so-called chair of the Liberal Party's task force on economic growth. This is very convenient for the Prime Minister to appoint Mr. Carney chair of the Liberal Party's task force when in fact he essentially is advising the Prime Minister on matters of economic policy, and that is to avoid Mr. Carney being subject to the Conflict of Interest Act and to avoid having to make disclosures pursuant to that act with respect to his many conflicts. Now, what are some of those conflicts? Well, every day we seem to learn of new conflicts. And by the way, the title is Chair of the Liberal Party's Task Force. Guess what? We found out that it is a one-person task force, namely Carbon Tax Carney, also known as Conflict Carney. And speaking of those conflicts, almost immediately following his appointment as the Prime Minister's advisor, evidently the Prime Minister's lost confidence in his utterly incompetent finance minister, Chrystia Freeland. And we find out that the government raises the threshold for insured mortgages from $1 million to $1.5 million. Now, what is the significance of that? Well, it just so happens that Carbon Tax Carney, also known as Conflict of Interest Carney, is the chair of none other than Brookfield. Now, what is Brookfield? It is a multinational investment management company that owns Sagen, the second largest mortgage insurer. So think about that. You have an advisor to the Prime Minister on economic policy who then, upon his appointment, the government just out of coincidence raises the threshold for insured mortgages, and that advisor just happens to be the chair of Brookfield, the owner of the second largest mortgage insurer. And of course, it resulted in Brookfield benefiting richly from that decision. In fact, their stock hit a 6-month high.
How convenient.
How convenient. But that's just scratching the surface of the conflicts, because shortly after that, Carbon Tax Carney, at Conflict of Interest Carney's close friend, who serves as CEO of Telesat, received $2.14 billion in taxpayer loans. That's interesting. And then we find out that Carbon Tax Carney, also known as Conflict of Interest Carney, is negotiating with the very government that he's supposedly advising. Well, according to the Prime Minister, he's not advising the government. He's not advising the Prime Minister. He's somehow just advising the Liberal Party. But everyone knows he's advising the government. He's advising the Prime Minister. He is the de facto finance minister. And then we find out that he's negotiating with the very same government to do what? To shake down taxpayers, asking for $10 billion in funds for Brookfield. Agreed. Conflict after conflict after conflict. And what is as bad is how arrogant this Prime Minister and Carbon Tax Conflict of Interest Carney have been to try to masquerade as an advisor to the Liberal Party, hoping that, or thinking that Canadians would be fooled by that. But of course, Canadians aren't fooled by that.
No chance.
It is very plain for the eye to see. It is brazen, blatant corruption and conflict. Conflict and corruption out in the open. After 9 years of this rotten, corrupt Prime Minister, they don't even try to hide the conflicts and the corruption.
They can't. In plain sight.
They can't. It's in plain sight. And so on that basis, we moved a motion to hear from Carbon Tax Carney, Conflict of Interest Carney, before this committee. It's an appropriate committee. It's the Ethics Committee. It is a committee that deals with matters of conflicts of interest, to provide oversight to see that the Conflict of Interest Act is being enforced, and to hold to account those who have breached the act or have engaged in otherwise unethical activities, who are public office holders or ministers or other officials in this government. And I can tell you, this committee is very, very busy because of all the work that this government has given it. And I would like to hear, and I think it's important for this committee to to scrutinize Mr. Carney, to ask him about how it is that the threshold for insured mortgages was raised almost immediately after he was appointed advisor to the Prime Minister, advisor to the Liberal Party, not when he is the chair of Brookfield, to answer for the fact that his close friend just happened to get $2 billion from the same government, again, just after he was appointed as economic advisor, and to explain how it is that he is, on the one hand, advising the Prime Minister and then negotiating, asking for $10 billion in funds for taxpayers for none other than Brookfield. It is about as rotten as it gets, out in the open, totally shameless. So, what do the Liberals do? When we bring forward a motion, it's what they always do. Mm-hmm. They scramble, they huddle, they wait for their talking points from the Prime Minister's office, and then they come in and they do everything that they can to shield the Prime Minister and his friends, including Mr. Carney, from accountability and from scrutiny. So they bring forward an amendment that they thought was rather clever to try to divert attention. They said, let's bring in Jenny Byrne. Well, why Jenny Byrne? She's not a federal lobbyist.
Nope.
Her firm doesn't do any federal lobbying.
Right.
But they want to hear from Ms. Byrne. Well, I don't have a problem. I don't think Mr. Barrett, Mr. Caputo, we don't have a problem. I don't think Ms. Byrne has a problem.
I'm sure not.
I think the Liberals will run out of questions very quickly. But maybe not. But we'll hear from her if that's what they want to do. But if Ms. Byrne is going to be called to appear, then it is appropriate that we hear from Gurtan Singh, given the fact that he is the brother of the NDP leader, an advisor to the NDP leader, a former MPP, and a lobbyist for none other than Metro. I mean, the NDP and the Liberals like to talk about laws. Well, that's fine, but we can also hear from a lobbyist for Metro who just happens to be an advisor and brother to the leader of the NDP. And then there's Don Guy. Don Guy, who just weeks ago was meeting behind closed doors at the Liberals' Nanaimo caucus retreat, standing, or certainly in the same room with the captain of the Titanic himself, the Prime Minister. And he was, as the Canadian press reported, called in to give insights on how to mount a comeback. And boy, do they have a lot of work to do, so I can't imagine what the advice would be other than to maybe tell the Prime Minister to take a hike. But in any event, Don Guy is someone who happens to be an advisor to the Liberals, to the Prime Minister. He was there behind closed doors. He happens to be also the founding partner of GT, which, unlike Ms. Byrne's firm, does extensive federal lobbying, and doesn't just do extensive federal lobbying on anything, but is a lobbyist for Loblaws and Canada Bread Company, which, as Mr. Barrett noted, has pled guilty to price fixing.
Price fixing.
That's Don Guy. That's the Liberal Party advisor, Don Guy, who employs Julie DeWolf, the former director of caucus services and operations at the Liberal Research Bureau, and the same Don Guy, who is the owner and chief strategist of Polera, who employs Dan Arnold, the Liberals' pollster. And I think that's another interesting connection. And Don Guy was also there advising the Prime Minister's ski buddy, the fake rapporteur, David Johnson, in his sham investigation into foreign interference and the Prime Minister's efforts to cover up Beijing's attack on our democracy in the 2019 and 2021 elections, which benefited the Liberal Party, as determined not just by, that's not just me saying it, Madam Justice Hogue concluded that Beijing's interference may have materially impacted the results in certain ridings, including Steveston, Richmond East, in which my colleague Kenny Chu was defeated as a consequence of disinformation spread by Beijing that was amplified by the Liberal Party and Justin Trudeau. So, in short, Mr. Chair, this is a very reasonable amendment. We're happy to hear from Ms. Byrne, but there is if Ms. Byrne is going to be invited, there are far stronger and more compelling grounds to invite other witnesses like Mr. Singh, like Mr. Guy, and like Mr. Guy's business partner, former NDP Chief of Staff, Brian Topp. Let's hear from all of them. Let's have them for 2 hours. There was an objection about having 1 hour for Mr. Singh, 1 hour for Ms. Byrne. Let's have them here for 2 hours. But really the most important person we need to hear from is Mr. Carney. He needs to come to committee and he needs to answer for all of his conflicts and to answer questions about exactly what his role is within this government and why he is seeking to shield himself from scrutiny and shield himself from having to disclose his many conflicts. So I may have more to say, but I will leave it at that for now, Mr. Chair.